Welcome to the Exploress. Time traveling through history, one era at a time. I'm Kate Armstrong. Hello, listeners. Season 4 is taking an intermission. I'll have us traveling back to the 1920s in the next couple of months. Until then, we've got a very special anniversary episode. This July, our show's been on the air for 5 whole years. I've had such a great time sharing immersive, occasionally sassy women's history stories, and I am so glad to have you here with me. Whether you're a longtime listener or a brand new one, it's an honor to time travel with you. To celebrate the Exploress's birthday, I'm pulling a vintage bonus episode out of the Patreon vault. You can thank my patrons for this one, who requested this dive into the lives of the women who rode aboard the ill-fated Titanic. Let's do a shout-out to some of them. My newest pirate queens, Carolyn, Elizabeth, and Christina. My warrior queens, Amber, Kiana, Alexis, Amanda, Kate, Ika, June, Neve and Sloan, and Samantha. My imperial empresses, Bridget, Faye and Whimsy Soapworks, Katie, Samara, and Teresa. And my lady pharaohs, Sophie, Lou, Laura, Kate, Kot, Cheryl, and the fabulous Courtneys. This show, and most especially this giant bonus episode, just wouldn't be possible without the generous support of my patrons. For just a few dollars a month, they get bonus episodes, like the one I'm about to drop about Elizabeth I and her lady pirate friend, early ad-free access to my episodes, sneak peeks, goodies, full interviews with my guests, and more. This month over on Patreon, I'll be giving away several fabulous books, so now's a good time to jump on. To find out all about it, just go to my website. On April 14th, 1912, on a cold night in the northern Atlantic, an iceberg hit a ship. That ship was the most luxurious passenger liner ever built, so top of the line that it was dubbed as Unsinkable. But sink it did. In only 2 hours and 40 minutes, the Titanic would be underwater forever. There were only enough lifeboats to save maybe half the souls on board, which meant that at least 1,500 people were destined to die. So who to save? The ship's captain made that clear when he issued an order that changed lives and sealed fates. Women and children first. In this bonus episode, we time travel back to Titanic's fateful voyage and try to see it through some of its female passengers' eyes. Who were the ladies aboard the Titanic? Why were they there, and what did they experience? What decisions did they make in those hours in the terrifying darkness and in the long nights afterward? How did this fateful voyage change their lives? Grab a big old hat, some fancy luggage, and perhaps a life jacket or two. Let's go traveling. First, we have to situate ourselves in the time period the Titanic sailed through. Welcome to 1912. In the UK, we find ourselves in what's called the Edwardian era, named after Queen Victoria's rakish son and heir. It isn't a long age. It runs from roughly 1901, when he is crowned, to 1914 and the start of the First World War. In Britain, it's a peaceful time. Some fifth of the world falls under the umbrella of the British Empire. It's as big and as important as it's ever going to get, but it's also about to start crumbling. The age takes a lot of its deciding qualities from King Edward himself, who, unlike his tightly corseted mother Victoria, is something of a lifelong party boy. We often refer to this time as the Gilded Age, and it's no wonder, given how much Edward likes life's finer things. He loves gambling, drinking, art, fine clothes, surrounding himself not with nobility, but with men who made their fortunes in trade and finance, and also with particularly fine American women, no matter that he's already married to a very banging British wife. In Britain, the landed gentry are a big deal. Picture Downton Abbey, which opens right after the Titanic sinks, you'll remember. And you'll have a great picture of what life was like for the very rich and the people who work for them. On both sides of the Atlantic, trade and industry are booming, changing the way we live. Some cool new inventions are coming on the scene. The vacuum cleaner, air conditioning, planes, the safety razor, plastic, the radio, the washing machine, motion pictures, the first affordable car, coffee filters, windshield wipers, and the bra. Those last three are all invented by ladies. Over in America, men are making fortunes in industry, producing their own brand of wealthy royalty. They're called the robber barons, with family names like Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, Morgan, Carnegie, and Astor. Before motion pictures really take off, they're the nation's celebs that everyone wants to read about. Newspapers report breathlessly about their parties, from the black pearls each guest finds on their plate as a party favor, to the cigars wrapped in $100 bills. And yet you'll find an incredibly yawning gap between rich and poor. This isn't yet the Roaring Twenties. It's a time when the rules are very strict, the list of them very long, and everything is very class-based. But there's some good news for the ladies. The first one is that in this era, we enjoy curves and a little extra fleshiness. In fact, one English reporter writes of American women, "They are constantly having themselves weighed, and every ounce of increase is hailed with delight." They're hungry for new roles in the public sphere as well. They're doing more shopping, becoming the driving force of domestic consumerism. They're eating out at restaurants, which they never really did before. Increased literacy is giving them wider access to knowledge and ideas. Inventions like the typewriter are giving them new forms of employment as well. By 1900, a third of all government jobs in America were taken by women. Although it must be said that most of them in the white-collar workplace are single, as they'll be expected to give up their working lives once they get married, and most of them are white as well. In a time when the outrageous is coveted, women are allowed to attract attention. So Gilded Age ladies are big on hats, and unfortunately, quite big on decorating them with real live feathers. Some feature entire pheasants stuffed and stuck onto hat brims. In 1911, 4 feather trading firms sold around 223,490 bird bodies in London alone. Yikes. Dead birds aside, women are finding new ways to live and travel. The new woman, as a popular beauty lecturer of the era put it, is a hardy playfellow, a good comrade for rides, walks, rows, golfs, and wouldn't be guilty of fainting for a kingdom. Women are getting out and about more, and women's suffrage is heating up in a major way. The movement is fractured, often along racial lines, and racism is still rife in England and America. But women of all colors and backgrounds are throwing their hats into several rings, the political and the social, working hard to make their world a better place. For one, there's Margaret Sanger. Just 2 years ago, in 1910, she moved to Greenwich Village and started a publication that promoted a woman's right to birth control. Horrors! But there's plenty of pushback, of course, and plenty of controversy to go along with it. There is a lot more to say about being a woman in 1912, of course, but we'll save that for when we time travel back here properly, for a day in the life of your average gal. For now, let's imagine you're standing on some docks in Southampton, England, gazing up at the sleekest, most gigantic ship you've ever seen. The Titanic is truly a marvel. It's 882.5 feet from prow to stern rail and 175 feet from keel to funnel top, stretching as long as 4 city blocks and as high as a 9-story building. With 15 steel bulkheads dividing its innards into watertight compartments, the men who built her swore she could make it through any disaster. Shipbuilder magazine looked it over and claimed that Titanic was virtually unsinkable. And there's no reason not to believe them. Ship disasters aren't on anyone's radars these days. In the past 40 years on the North Atlantic, only 4 passengers have died at sea. It pays to remember that, in this time of mass migration and before commercial planes are really a thing, commercial ship travel is really big business. Titanic springs from a competition between ship companies like America's White Star and Britain's Cunard. These rivals are racing to build ships with one mantra in mind: bigger, better, faster. When Cunard introduces two beauties called the Lusitania and Mauretania in 1906 and 7, the pressure was on to build the ship that everyone wanted to travel the seas on. J. Bruce Ismay, heir to the White Star Line, knew it. So one night in the London home of a guy named Lord Peary in the summer of 1907, he and a clutch of gentlemen discussed how they could one-up their competition. It didn't seem likely that they could build ships to go faster than Cunard's, but perhaps they could focus in on the bigger and better part? Over brandy, Lord Peary sketched the ships Ismay wanted. They would be three, all alike: Olympic, Titanic, and Gigantic, later renamed Britannic. These fine ladies would be fancier and just all around better than any that came before them. Titanic will be Ismay's baby in pretty much every way. Over the course of 2 years, more than 15,000 workers toil in Belfast, Ireland, to build them out of iron and steel. By the time Titanic is done, she is something new and entirely novel, and everybody wants a piece. And that's how we ended up here in Southampton on the morning of its true maiden voyage, April 10th, 1912. Are you worried about disaster at sea? Nah. When one passenger, Sylvia Caldwell, asks a deckhand if the ship is really unsinkable, he responds, "Yes, lady. God himself could not sink this ship." So who is sailing on this modern marvel? Before we talk about that, it's important to remember this is a very class-conscious time. If you're a Downton Abbey fan, and who isn't, you'll know what I mean. There was a very big chasm between upstairs and downstairs, master and servant, living in intimately connected but entirely separate worlds. This is true in America too, though perhaps not as entrenched and intractable. The Gilded Age rich see themselves as many rungs above the common folk. But it's a time of change too, socially, technologically, culturally. Workers are starting to demand their due, and the social strata doesn't feel as secure as it once did. But still, on Titanic, different classes are not meant to mix and mingle, which is basically the whole center of the plot in the movie Titanic. Who doesn't love a forbidden love story? Ah, Leo, you'll always be the king of my world. But how to keep such lovers apart when you've got teachers and coal shovelers traveling on the same ship as some of the Western world's most wealthy magnates? Separate them out into levels, of course, and those levels vary wildly in terms of comfort and glam. Let's explore the ship as we meet our ladies coming aboard, shall we? Inevitably, we'll start at the top in first class. If the Titanic was a 3-tiered wedding cake, this would be the fancy cream on the top of it. You know, with the buttercream rosebuds painted with gold leaf. Lavish, elaborate, and fancy as hell. As one of Titanic's 337 first-class passengers, we will experience some fascinating and luxurious marvels. Let's take a little tour and some selfies, because this baby boasts things a ship at sea has never had before. A heated swimming pool, a Turkish bath with a cooling room decked out like a sultan's palace, a modern gymnasium, a dark room, cafes with live palm trees, a squash court, 3 elevators. The regular modern-day cruisegoers among you may not be impressed by this, but in 1912, this is all completely unprecedented. There are even marble-top tables and floors covered in the newest and most marvelous material, linoleum.
We had regular beds and a handsome dressing table and chairs,
says first-class passenger Jean Hippatch.
And there was a lavatory with hot and cold running water. And there were electric lights, an electric fan, and an electric curling iron. And of course, push buttons. Everything you could think of.
Running water and electricity at sea. Consider this, it won't be until 1925 that even half of all homes in America will have electric power. So to have it at sea on a giant boat?
One of our friends,
Jean Hippatch said,
when her husband asked her if she could think of anything to add to the equipment, laughed and said, "Well, we might have butter spreaders. I can't think of anything else."
But the grand staircase is particularly impressive. You'll remember Leonardo DiCaprio looking dashing at the top of it with that bowl cut that I miss so much. Sunlight pours onto it through a white enameled glass dome, bathing the very fancy clock in its carved figures representing honor and glory. The dining hall is also a little jaw-dropping. It can seat 554, though of course you have to be from first class to enjoy it, done up in fancy French style. This seems like a normal thing to have on a cruise ship now, but remember, this is 1912 when most people eat dinner at home, not in restaurants featuring food made fresh by European chefs. Lunch on the ship's final day will feature grilled mutton chops, baked jacketed potatoes, salmon mayonnaise, Norwegian anchovies, and corned ox tongue. There are fresh pastries served on real White Star china. It's all just overwhelmingly lush.
Fancy strawberries in April.
First-class passenger Lady Duff Gordon will write.
And in mid-ocean, the whole thing is positively uncanny. Why, you would think you were at the Ritz.
Those with money to burn can enjoy one of the 2 most exclusive parlor suites on B-Deck, complete with a private promenade for some $4,350 one way. That's roughly $64,000 in modern dollars. Compare that to a third-class fare at just $36 and you'll see what a steep difference we're dealing with. Who are these lucky ladies? Some are very rich and very famous. The person who takes the most expensive suite on the boat, the same one they recreated for Rose to use in the movie Titanic, is 58-year-old Charlotte Drake Cardiza. Here are some of the highlights from her obituary in the New York Times. Noted yachtswoman who twice circumnavigated the globe, active in philanthropy, and one of the world's only female big game hunters. Okay, this woman is definitely living a lush, rich person's life. But of course, she's more than her money. As one friend wrote, she had a wonderful mind, a splendid knowledge of literature, was conversant with the best in music and art. Perhaps the most outstanding characteristic was her kindness, particularly to the poor and those in trouble. There's also 48-year-old Lady Duff Gordon, one of Britain's most famous couturiers. This red-haired entrepreneur is very fabulous, so indulge me while I delve into some backstory. She was born Lucy Christiana to an English bridge builder and a Canadian beauty, but Dad died young, so she mostly grew up on a farm in Canada. She was a self-proclaimed tomboy, riding every horse she came across with the boys from the farms next door. Her French grandma tried her best to work some manners into her, but by her teens, she was charming, confident, and a big bundle of personality, which in the Gilded Age isn't always an easy thing to be.
I do not think that, on the whole, it is good for a woman to have temperament.
She writes later.
It is much better for her to be a vegetable, and certainly much safer, but I never had the choice.
Lucy grew up to love fashion through dressing up her dolls, studying the gowns she saw in family paintings, and making clothes for her and her sister from scratch. She marries a guy named James Stewart Wallace, who turns out to be rather a lout with all of his drinking and affair-having, so she goes ahead and has some affairs of her own with guys like Sir Morrel Mackenzie, a charming surgeon. Get it, Lucy? Eventually, she divorces his ass and, to support herself and her daughter, opens up a dress shop at home. Later, she opens a shop called Maison Lucille in London. From there, she goes ahead and becomes one of the most famous and innovative fashion designers of her day. There's a lot to say at this moment about how fashion is changing and how Lucille helps it along. Ladies' fashion is in the middle of an evolution from the ultra-feminine S-shaped silhouettes of the Edwardian era to the columnar, boyish silhouettes of the 20s. The S-shape is a softer and more natural shape than the one that we were wearing in the 19th century, for sure, but it's still awkward, pushing our busts forward while forcing our butts back, kind of like a duck while running. We are starting to move away from the whole full corset situation, and bras are starting to arrive on the scene, though the first won't be officially patented until 1914. There are still a lot of things constricting our movement, though, and although fashion icon Paul Poiret introduces the racy harem pantaloons in 1911 for the most daring of fashionistas, pants are generally off limits. Hobble skirts are in too, sadly, Imagine you're wearing a floor-length skirt and your kid's just taken a string and tied it tight around your ankles. That's precisely what this looks like. The name hobble skirt comes from a word for binding together a horse's hooves, which tells you just about how comfy this fad is. And while some of them do look nice and chic, they're certainly far from practical. Get ready for some awkward mincing, ladies. Feminists like it, as it means they can ditch their petticoats, but it's not the kind of thing you want to wear if you want to walk freely. There are certainly plenty of women who are well and truly over it. Take Helen Churchill Candy, who we'll meet properly in a minute. In 1897, she wrote,
"The gentle woman of the public is slow at throwing aside prejudice in favor of good sense. Fancy the relief to tired women if all skirts worn out of the house were shortened 6 inches above the ground, and fancy the tons of bedraggled, germ-filled dry goods of which their delicate frames would be relieved."
Women who sport this look are called rainy daisies, and we can only hope that Helen Candy is among them. Lady Duff Gordon is at the forefront of making our outfits more comfortable and practical, but no less fabulous. Paul Poiret likes to claim that he's the first to abolish the corset, but Lady Duff Gordon is on the leading edge right along with him. She also introduces slits in our skirts so that we can move more freely. Girl, I haven't been able to breathe like this since 1785. She is a trailblazer, the first to use mannequins in presenting her collections. She even coins the word chic, and her chic advice is still spot on.
"One never grows tired of a simple gown,"
she wrote,
"and neither do one's friends. Such a gown is always in fashion, and with a smart hat and neat shoes, one is always becomingly dressed. And as for the career girl, wear black by all means."
This is an era before off-the-rack fashion, where the fanciest ladies are going to design houses to get their dresses made to order. I've only done this once before for my wedding dress, and while I felt fancy as hell, it was not a cheap experience. But many middle-class women are discovering the joys of department stores. Paris's Bon Marché in 1852. Philadelphia's Wanamaker in 1876, Macy's in 1858, whose co-owner will sail on the Titanic with his wife. They've been springing up for decades, and they're continuing to thrive, offering a whole new model for shopping. Free entrance without obligation to buy, set prices with no haggling, refunds and exchanges. These are places where women can mix and mingle without chaperones and pick out dresses they like and have them fitted to their bodies. Fashion is getting more accessible than ever. And on Titanic, as on land, what you wear says a lot about you. For our fancy first-class ladies, this is a 5-day party where they'll be strutting their stuff all day long on the decks. We'll be changing our outfits some 4 times a day to stick with social convention. Morning gown, tea gown, dinner dress, and probably a few more in there somewhere. And that means we've brought a lot of our wardrobe on board with us. We don't know exactly why Lucille is going to America on this voyage, but we think she may be going to inaugurate her spring collection in America. She's at the height of her fashion career with so much to look forward to. With her is her second husband, the rich and delightfully named Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon, and her maid, Laura Francatelli, called Franks.
"I was entranced by the beauty of the liner,"
she will later say.
"I had never dreamed of sailing in such luxury. My pretty little cabin, with its electric heater and pink curtains, delighted me. Everything about this lovely ship reassured me."
Another equally forceful personality on board is Margaret Molly Brown. This live wire from Hannibal, Mississippi, moved out to Leadville, Colorado as a young thing, where she put on penny plays for the locals. One of those was a guy named J.J. Brown, and he was quite taken with red-haired Irish Molly. But it took a whole lot of convincing to get her to finally agree to be his wife. This mining engineer had respectable prospects, but no money. Though he did have an 8th interest in a gold mine, and that investment eventually made them both quite rich. Molly moved from log cabin to brick mansion and set about making a name for herself as a fine lady in Denver. But the society ladies there weren't keen to let her into the club. She was brash, loud, and over the top in every way that mattered. So Molly Brown got to studying. She studied language and literature at Carnegie Hall in New York, went to Paris to improve her French, over to Spain to learn how to play the guitar, and then to Switzerland, where she learned how to yodel. as one must. And all along the way, she made friends. She was big on style, personality, and philanthropy, throwing fabulous parties to raise money for worthwhile charities. She wore jewels in her hair and carried around a swagger stick, which she said she needed because of her fallen arches, but maybe just for a bit of flair. By 1912, she and her husband have separated, but she's still got plenty of money. She's just enjoyed a trip to Egypt, Rome, and Paris with her daughter Helen, along with JJ and Madeline Astor, but news of her sick grandson has her booking a ticket home on the Titanic. There's also authoress Helen Churchill Candy. I'm kind of obsessed with this woman. She is extremely well-traveled, a fearless writer, and not afraid to speak her mind in ways that are not all that acceptable for a woman of her time. In 1900, she published a book called How Women May Earn a Living, directed at
all those women who labor through necessity and not caprice.
She should know. After a messy divorce with her husband, she had to write to pay the bills to support her 2 kids. While traveling alone on the Titanic, she finds herself quickly adopted by a group of men who become her companions and protectors. A polo player, an architect, a Swedish military hunk, all clamoring for this 53-year-old's conversation. And she's not 100% sure how she feels about it. Every day, she takes out 2 deck chairs on the promenade deck, as she says, for herself and
the other for callers or for self-protection.
35-year-old Lucy May Futrell is another writer aboard. This Southern belle from Atlanta and her writer husband, Jacques, have been madly in love since the day they met. As she pushed and encouraged him in his writing career, so too did she write her own work. Just last year, in 1911, they both had books published. Hers was called, fabulously, Secretary of Frivolous Affairs. Jacques' become quite famous for his Van Dusen mystery series, which some say helped popularize the mystery genre in America. That's why they've been in Europe. He's carrying some $30,000 in advances from publishers in his pockets. So confident are they in the work he'll write next. This sail aboard Titanic for them is the icing on a very exciting cake. Her equally impressive friend is 36-year-old Irene Wallach Harris, called Renee. Born in Washington, D.C., an enterprising gal, she met her much-beloved husband Henry when she was studying in New York by day and working as a legal secretary at night to pay the bills. Henry just so happened to be quite a famous Broadway producer. As their relationship grew, he came to rely more and more upon her excellent judgment. "I never take an important step without consulting Renee," he said. "If anything happened to me, she could pick up the reins." There's also Ida Bloom Strauss and her husband Isidore. They are perhaps the cutest couple aboard, having been extremely happily married for 38 years. Both immigrants to America, he's part owner of Macy's department store, so kind of a big deal. They use their money and status to do a lot of work for good causes, like the Educational Alliance of New York, which instructs Jewish immigrants like them in how to be responsible citizens. They give to hospitals and orphanages, work for women's causes. Isidore even serves in Congress. Though they are sometimes discriminated against just for being Jewish, they never stop doing what they can for others, and each other. Whenever they're apart, they write each other every single day. In one such letter, written in 1904, Isidore says to his wife, "If I should die before you, I desire to give you a few suggestions for your guidance, which may prove very welcome to aid you in what otherwise might be a puzzling proposition. You have an ample income. Enjoy it. Deprive yourself nothing which can contribute to your comfort and happiness. Be a little selfish. Don't always think of others. You have much left to live for. Therefore, don't be despairing. Be thankful for the happiness which was vouchsafed to use so many years." But first class is harboring its fair share of scandal. There's the couple you met over tea this morning who call themselves Mr. and Mrs. George Thorne. The fact is, there is no George Thorne, and they aren't married. George Rosenshine of New York City is sailing with Gertrude Maybelle Thorne, his mistress. To divert unwanted attention, Rosenshine went ahead and changed their names. And then there's the less illicit, but just as socially awkward situation that is Madeline Force Astor and her hunky, rich husband, John Jacob Astor Astor IV. He comes from one of America's most famous wealthy families. At a worth of some $87 million, he is just rolling in dough. But money doesn't save him from some nasty rumors about his choice of wife. When 18-year-old Madeline met 47-year-old Jack, no one was overly concerned about their little flirtation. After all, he was a playboy divorcee who tended to like sweet young things. But then, in 1911, they announced their engagement, much to the shock horror of society. She was not only young, but socially quite a few rungs below him. So bad was the situation that Jack has to pay a pastor £200 to marry them, and none of their friends come to watch. To get out of the limelight, they went on honeymoon in Europe and even hopped over to Egypt for a tour with Molly Brown. But then Madeline fell very swiftly pregnant, and they decide to sail back home aboard the Titanic. Of course, second class is nothing to shake a stick at. Its 271 passengers enjoy accommodations that would have passed as first class on most vessels of the day. They get the same food, though not as many choices as first class, and less elegant plates. Rude! Second class has its own library, comfy beds, and a spacious outdoor promenade, even a smoking room. The dining room alone can seat 2,400 people and features a pianist. And there are interesting characters here, too. Annie Funk is a Pennsylvania girl and Christian missionary who spent the last 6 years in a small village in India. When she arrived there, she found there were no schools for girls, and no one wanted to see girls in the schoolroom. So Annie spent 2 years getting the school funded and built, with its cow dung floor and all, and went door to door to convince local families to let their daughters attend. But when she got a letter saying her mother was quite sick, she headed home, leaving in a hurry. And that's how she ends up in second class. Her family doesn't even know she's on the Titanic. There's also Edwina Trout, born so sickly that her parents had a coffin made for her, which, thankfully, was never used. She's spent her life proving to people how strong and daring she is. She first crossed the Atlantic in 1907 at the tender age of 23 because one of her friends dared her to do it. Tired of working menial jobs in England, she gives herself 5 years to live it up as a single gal in NYC, working as a waitress, until her frail lungs just couldn't handle it. But now her sister is in Pennsylvania, about to give birth, so she's headed back to America again. There's also Kate Buss and Marion Wright, both of whom are sailing to America to marry their sweethearts who are waiting for them. All of these women have big things to look forward to. Imagine the excitement of the journey ahead. There's scandal in second class, too. Kate Florence Phillips, age 19, is aboard with one Henry Samuel Morley, 39. They fell in love over bonbons when she worked in his sweet shop. He sold his business back in England and left his wife and sweet shop behind to elope with her to America. This is a decision she's most definitely going to rue. And now we descend some stairs, where 712 passengers are boarding at E-Deck. Yep, we're in third class. You'll remember the general look of this level from the Titanic movie, I imagine. Dark, cramped, rustic, maybe cozy. It isn't exactly luxury, but the rooms are clean, and with regular meals and comfortable beds, much better than what a lot of the poorer passengers are used to. There are only 2 bathtubs for all those people. But given there's still a belief that cleanliness can kill you, it isn't actually some kind of mean oversight. Single men, married couples, and families all have berths in the forward section, while single women stay aft and are bunked together in groups. Kids run around and play wherever they can find space, in passages and companionways. Dozens of languages fly over communal dining tables as they eat hearty fare like corned beef, puddings, and kidney pie. Most of these passengers are immigrants in search of a better life. In this time period, immigration is turning into big business. In the 4 years leading up to World War I, some 1 million people come to America each year. They're a big part of what helps keep transatlantic travel businesses afloat. So White Star aggressively marketed the Titanic, promising it was both the best and the most affordable for third class. They hail from Italy, Germany, Sweden, Norway, Ireland, the Middle East. 14 of them come from the same Irish parish of Abergule. Most of these are young women, and they all know each other. 11 of the 14 of them will die, which means their parish suffers greater loss, proportionately speaking, than anywhere else. And it goes to highlight a sad truth of this voyage. The most women to die will come from this class. These women, so many of whom boarded alone, having said goodbye to the only life they've ever known, will die out in that cold, unforgiving darkness. They pack their bags, all their belongings sometimes, and their dreams. Ones that only 121 out of 262 will get to try their hands at fulfilling. So let's get this voyage underway. The ship flies jauntily into ports at Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, Ireland. Some passengers get on, and others get off, not knowing that their lives hang in the balance. Let's meet a few more of them. In Cherbourg, first-class passenger Ida Hippach and her daughter Jean hop on. They've already experienced their fair share of tragedy. Years before, Ida lost 2 of 3 sons by tragic accident. They went down with 630 other poor souls in an overpacked theater in Chicago when an arc light caught fire. The family was gutted, and years later, Ida still isn't coping all that well. Ida's husband thought it would be a good idea for his wife and his daughter to go on a little trip overseas, like they'd done in the past. You know, blow off some steam, buy some dresses. They were supposed to return home on the Olympic instead, but they wanted to spend more time in Europe shopping, so they switched to the Titanic. Can you imagine reflecting later, knowing your fate changed solely because you wanted to buy some new gloves? On April 14th, the ship's captain, Captain Smith, keeps to his normal Sunday routine. Part of that is inspecting the ship, but he doesn't bother conducting the boat drill that normally follows it. I mean, that's just a hassle. He leads a worship service and then meets with his officers to fix the ship's position. The sun sets, lowering the temperature to freezing. The sea is flat, shining like glass.
It was all so quiet, but how penetratingly cold it had become.
Violet Jessup will write later,
Little wisps of mist like tiny fairies wafted gently inward from the sea and left my face clammy.
Violet, by the way, has already survived one accident on a White Star vessel, the Olympic, when it crashed into a military ship in 1911. She is going to survive the Titanic and then the sinking of her sister ship, Britannic, in 1916. The only reason she saved from that last disaster, she says, is because of the shine of her bright auburn hair. That's 3 brushes with death by boat. If that won't give you a fear of the water, I don't know what will. All is calm, and it seems safe enough, but flat seas mean no breakers to flash white against icebergs, signaling their lurking presence. Still, the captain keeps the boat at full speed. Even though they get some 5 radio messages from nearby ships warning of ice, the radio operator aboard is very busy sending passengers personal messages. There's no time for such trivialities. At 10:55 p.m., when a ship called Californian radios about having to stop amidst a dense ice field, that operator shouts back, "Shut up, I'm busy!" Frederick Fleet sees the iceberg and sounds the alarm just before 11:40. An officer yanks the handle of the engine room, ordering them to steer left and slow down. For 30 seconds or more, the crew holds their breaths, waiting. Then the ship swings to port, an icy mountain sliding by the starboard side. Chunks of ice fall on the deck, but most of them think the worst is over. They've missed it. Little do they know the real danger lies below the surface, where ice skids along the hull plates, punching holes in its airtight compartments as it goes. Some people think now that if the ship had gone faster, or even took the hit head-on, it might have avoided disaster entirely. Some of the passengers in the upper levels don't seem to hear it, but they feel it. Renee Harris and her Broadway husband Henry, along with Mae Futrell and her writer husband Jacques, had a great night dressed up and eating a luxurious dinner at a table filled to bursting with roses. Jacques goes to bed early with a headache, and after not finding any good books in the first-class library, Mae follows. Renee and Henry are playing cards in their room. She slipped on a tea cake earlier in the day, so she's got one arm in a sling, and it's hurting her badly. Wrapped in 2 bathrobes to ward off the night's chill, she notices her clothes swinging in the closet. She doesn't think much about it until the engines stop. While May and Renee's husbands go to see what's happening, they sit together holding hands. May will tell the Boston Globe later,
"That very afternoon, one of the officers had explained to us that this gong was only used as a signal for the closing of the watertight compartments in case of emergency."
She heard a gong and was filled with dread. But the ever-over-the-top Molly Brown makes it all sound a lot more dramatic. Later, she will tell the Newport Herald,
"I stretched out on the brass bed, at the side of which was a lamp. So completely absorbed in my reading, I gave little thought to the crash that struck at my window overhead and threw me to the floor."
Ella White says the noise sounded a whole lot like 1,000 marbles. Lady Duff Gordon says it was
as if some giant hand had been playing lawn bowls.
Violet Jessup describes it as
A low, rending, crunching, ripping sound as Titanic shivered a trifle and the sound of her engines gently ceased.
But what alarms some people most is the sudden silence.
"Everything outside appeared as usual,"
writes Lady Duff Gordon later.
"but I was uneasy. The roar of the steam still continued to alarm me. Presently, it stopped, and there came an infinitely more frightening silence. The engines had stopped. Something in the cessation of this busy, homely sound filled me with panic."
When ship designer Thomas Edwards is summoned to survey the damage, he doesn't like what he sees. The much-publicized watertight bulkheads only rise as high as E deck, which is above the surface in most ships, but useless if its bow is sinking and seawater is able to lap its way over the bulkhead's top edges. With a sinking heart, he knows that the water filling the first 5 compartments will pull the ship deeper and deeper, flooding them like dominoes. This ship only has about 2 hours to live. Around 12 a.m., orders go out to radio for help and to fill the lifeboats. There isn't any time to waste. But it's a big ship and there's a lot of confusion.
"I again looked out and saw a man whose face was blanched, his eyes protruding, wearing the look of a haunted creature,"
said Molly Brown.
"He was gasping for breath, and in an undertone he gasped, 'Get your lifesaver.'"
Emerging from their rooms, passengers make their way up top. But some go back for valuables or for warmer clothing, and for some of them, they'll never come back out again. It's a strange sight seeing everyone in their fancy dress and life jackets. Helen Churchill Candie is roused by not one but 2 of her male admirers, told to dress quickly and head up on deck.
Up the sweep of the regal stairway was advancing a solid procession of all the ship's passengers.
She will write later in a fictionalized piece about the night.
Wordless, orderly, quiet, and only the dress told of the tragedy. On every man and every woman's body was tied the sinister emblem of the sea, and each one walked with his life-clutching pack to await the coming horrors. It was as fancy dress ball in Dante's hell.
Then the captain gets on the megaphone and barks out 4 words that save lives and damn them, changing fortunes and sealing fates.
"Women and children first."
The thing is that his officers all take this order differently. On the port side, Officer Lightoller fills his boats with only women and children, no matter how many men are standing nearby. Meanwhile, on the starboard side, Officer Murdoch boards as many of them as he can, then gives the remaining seats to men. A lot of factors conspire to make this a huge disaster, but here's the main one. According to the Board of Trade regulations, any ship over 10,000 tons has to have at least 16 lifeboats, but the Titanic is 46,000 tons and holding 2,235 people. No matter, they reasoned that such a ship had pretty much 0 chance of sinking, so let's not worry about it. And believe it or not, this is actually a high number of lifeboats for your average commercial ship at the time. Besides, reasoned Bruce Ismay, they're ugly. Let's not clutter up the decks, okay? Imagine being an officer in this moment and doing that daunting math. 16 wooden lifeboats and 4 canvas-sided Engelhart boats. That's it. And it's only enough to save maybe half the ship's passengers in the middle of a freezing ocean on a ship that is on its way to a watery grave. They don't fill them to capacity, the officers will argue later, because the crew doubts that the lowering mechanisms can bear the weight of 70 passengers. And as we'll see shortly, there's a lot of delay because these guys have never lowered the boats before. This is where some emergency drills would have come in handy, Captain. But they also know they can't waste time waiting for people to fill the boats before sending the ships off. Otherwise, they risk the vessel sinking with the ship or being sucked into its pull. One of them will be. J.J. Astor and his young, pregnant wife huddle together in the gymnasium. When she first hears about the iceberg hitting the ship, she's quoted as saying,
"I rang for ice, but this is ridiculous."
She's certainly not joking now. JJ distracts her by cutting open a life bell to show her how it's made. Then, when the time comes, he helps her through a porthole window on A deck into lifeboat number 4. Being a man, he isn't allowed to join her. But he doesn't complain. Instead, he calmly hands her gloves, then turns and helps everyone else he can find into the boat. One of them is Jean Hipatch, and she will never forget it.
The last lifeboat was being lowered when Mr. Astor saw us.
She will say in an interview later.
He ordered the boat raised so that my mother could get into it. "Don't lower that boat until this woman gets in," said Mr. Astor. We were compelled to climb through a porthole in order to reach the boat, but my mother would not get in unless I joined her. Mr. Astor again showed chivalry by pleading with the officers to permit me to get into the lifeboat, and they did.
First-class passenger Edith Rosenbaum is one of many who dawdle in their cabins, both out of uncertainty and because they don't want to leave without their valuables. By the time she gets into the boat, things are starting to get crazy. This is where rewatching Titanic will help to give you a feel for what these women are facing. Remember that a lot of these boats aren't on the deck, they're dangling over the side at this point, swinging in the cold midnight air with several feet between the boat and them. The thought of jumping through space hundreds of feet above dark, frigid water and into one of these cannot be overly appealing. Seeing that Edith is a bit scared to launch herself through space into lifeboat number 11, 2 crewmen pick her up and just hurl her. She's also wearing a hobble skirt of only 18 inches in circumference and no underwear, so, that's awkward. A few other wonderful facts about Edith. She has a lucky golden pig under one of her arms, which she takes with her everywhere, and which in the confusion, one of the crewmen takes to be a baby. He actually grabs it from her and throws it into the boat to ensure that she gets in. Also, she's a fashion writer, and as such will later write about what Titanic survivors are wearing as they make for the lifeboats.
Lucille, Lady Duff Gordon,
she'll write,
made her escape in a very charming lavender bathrobe, very beautifully embroidered, together with a very pretty blue veil.
Seeing some lifeboats about to be lowered without enough people aboard, ladies do what they can to try to get men in the seats. But you know they suck at taking direction. And they don't want to be seen as cowards. Dorothy Gibson, a popular actress, flirts a few of her male followers into Lifeboat 17 with her, thus saving their lives. Others end up with unanticipated cargo.
I stood at the bulkhead with the other stewardesses,
Violet Jessup wrote,
watching women cling to their husbands before being put into the boats with their children. Sometime after, a ship's officer ordered us into the boat first, to show some women it was safe. As the boat was being lowered, the officer called, "Here, Miss Jessup, look after this baby," and a bundle was dropped into my lap.
Some women don't want to get on a lifeboat. They want to help others instead. Molly Brown spends much of these 2 hours helping women into lifeboats with little regard for her own safety. In the end, a couple of men actually pick her up and pitch her into a boat, not concerned about whether she wants to go or not. Many women don't want to be separated from their loved ones. They plead and cry and scream, saying they'll be saved with their men or not at all. Renee Harris is also not budging.
The captain looked amazed when he saw me. "My God, woman, why aren't you in a lifeboat?" I kept repeating. "I won't leave my husband. I won't leave my husband." The little doctor said, "Isn't she a brick?" To which the captain replied, "She's a little fool. She's handicapping her husband's chances to save himself."
And then there's sweet Ida Strauss. When told to get on a lifeboat without her husband Isidore, she flatly refuses.
"I've always stayed with my husband,"
she supposedly says.
"So why should I leave him now?"
Long ago, these two were born on the same day. Tonight, they'll die together too. It isn't all men giving up their seats and their chance at living for others. Sometimes women do it too. First-class passenger Edith Corse Evans, along with Edith and Caroline Brown, are in the final scramble for boats, all of which they find already filled to bursting. They are ordered from one side of the ship to another, getting more and more frantic as they go. At last, they find themselves at Collapsible D, which will be the last rescue vessel to leave the Titanic.
There you may imagine our feelings,
Caroline writes later,
when the officer in command said that there was room for only one more woman. Men stayed back and did not crowd. Miss Evans was by my side at the time. She pushed me towards the boat, saying, "Please, take this lady. She has children."
And then there's our Christian missionary, Annie Funk. She's already in a lifeboat when a woman comes flying toward it, screaming for her children. They're on the boat, and she wants to go with them, but crew members hold her back. There just isn't room. So Annie calmly gets out and offers her seat to the mother. Imagine being so close to safety, then handing it over freely. Hopefully she's comforted by the words she wrote to her family years before.
Our Heavenly Father is as near to us on sea as on land.
The water is rising, the ship tilting, the chances of living slipping away. Things are starting to get hectic.
On the port side,
wrote Lady Duff Gordon,
there was a scene of indescribable horror. Boat after boat was being lowered in a pandemonium of rushing figures.
She and her husband hurry to Lifeboat 1. It has capacity for 40 people, but leaves with only 12 on board. There are a lot of reasons the lifeboats aren't full. Some of them are reasonable, some are just awful. Regardless, when they float away from the Titanic, there are more than 400 empty seats. Through it all, these women are in anguish for those they left behind. 18-year-old Eloise Hughes Smith has only just gotten married to her husband, who she left behind on board. He had to trick her to get into a lifeboat. She'll find out later that she is carrying her dead husband's child. Aboard the Carpathia, the ship that rescues survivors, she'll meet one Robert Daniel, a wealthy banker who consoles her in her sadness. They'll get married in 1914. Now that's a whirlwind. Kate Phillips, the second-class passenger who was riding incognito with the older sweet shop owner she ran away from England with, must be gutted to find herself alone, watching her lover sink into the darkness. Little does she know that she's also pregnant and will have to return home to face the ramifications of her actions and the life of an unwed mother without the man she ran away with. Imagine the agony of watching a ship disappear with someone you love still aboard it, so close and yet worlds away.
The last I saw of my husband,
May Futrell writes later,
he was standing beside Colonel Astor. He had a cigarette in his mouth, of course. As I watched him, he lit a match and held it in his cupped hands before his face. By its light, I could see his eyes roam anxiously over the water. Their faces stood out together as the match flared at the cigarette tip. I know those hands. They never trembled.
It isn't hard to imagine what these women must feel as they are rowed away from the sinking ship that has been their home at sea.
The water was like glass,
said Helen Walton Bishop, aged 19.
There wasn't even the ripple usually found on a small lake. By the time we had pulled away 100 yards, the lower row of portholes had disappeared. When we were a mile away, the second row had gone. But there was still no confusion. Indeed, everything seemed to be quiet on the ship, until her stern was raised out of the water by the list forward. Then, a veritable wave of humanity surged up out of the steerage and shut the lights from our view. We were too far away to see the passengers individually, but we could see the black mass of human forms and hear their death cries and groans.
Madeline Force Astor will say later that she sees her dog Kitty running along the deck. She thought her husband must have gone and let him and the other dogs out, so at least they'd have a chance. One end of the ship rises higher and higher, tipping out of the water. Above, the stars twinkle.
The water was very still.
Jean Hippatch will say later.
And the sky. So many stars. You can't think how it felt out there alone by ourselves in the Atlantic. And there were so many shooting stars. I never saw so many in my life. You know, they say when you see a shooting star, someone is dying. We thought of that, for there are so many dying not far.
For a few seconds,
Lady Duff Gordon wrote,
she stayed motionless while the agonized cries from her decks grew in intensity, and then, with one awful downward rush, she plunged to her grave through fathoms of water, and the air was rent with those awful shrieks.
With so few men in so many of the boats, many women have to step up and row themselves, though they're soaked to the skin and struggling through the cold. In Lifeboat 8, Noelle, the Countess of Roths, gets up and takes charge, directing a lot of what happens. The guy who's supposed to be in charge of her boat, Thomas Jones, is so impressed that he later sends her the number plate off the side of the lifeboat as a thank you keepsake. She finds herself comforting a sobbing woman who has left her husband behind.
Poor woman,
she writes later.
Her sobs tore our hearts, and her moans were unspeakable in their sadness.
Many women are supremely unhappy with how the men amongst them are acting. Molly Brown spars with Quartermaster Hitchens over control of her boat, trying to get him to turn around and help others in the water, at one point threatening to throw him overboard. And of course, there is that pressing question. Do we turn our lifeboat around and try to save people, or will they swamp us and take us down too?
The dreadful regret I shall always have,
wrote Gladys Cherry to the man in charge of her boat much later,
is that we ought to have gone back to whom we could pick up. But if you remember, there was only an American lady, my cousin, self, and you who wanted to return. I shall always remember your words. Ladies, if any of us is saved, remember, I wanted to go back. I would rather drown with them than leave them.
Those in the lifeboats are far from out of danger. Many are in wet clothes, and not enough of them, and they have no idea how long they'll be floating there. Of the 9 passengers who are rescued from the water, 3 of them die shortly afterward. No one's sure what's going to happen next. Lady Duff Gordon speaks of one woman who tells her that a man in her boat collapsed over his oar, and when she tried to restore him, she found that he was dead from cold and exhaustion. Not sure what to do, she propped him up against her knee and pressed close to the dead man all night long so the other women in her boat wouldn't panic.
After we had been afloat for several hours without food or water,
said Helen Walton Bishop,
and everyone suffering from the cold, I felt certain we should all perish. I took off my stockings and gave them to a little girl who hadn't had as much time to dress as I had.
Miles away, the Cunard liner Carpathia receives Titanic's distress calls and gets underway, straight into the ice field surrounding its final position. They hurry on, firing rockets every 15 minutes to give hope to survivors, but for those in the water, there is almost no hope at all. The air temperature is hovering around freezing, and the water is just as bad. Reports say it dips as low as 28 degrees Fahrenheit. In water that cold, you'll be lucky to stay conscious for more than 10 minutes, and you'll probably be dead in 45. Even those who don't know the facts about hypothermia must know those in the water will die if they don't help them. This is a moment that will haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. At 3:30 a.m., about an hour after the sinking, the Carpathia arrives to rescue whoever is left. When they get hauled up on board, everyone is tired, many are injured, and everything's in disarray.
I, with a great many others, slept on the dining room tables,
wrote second-class passenger Susan Weber.
And it wasn't soft wood, either. We didn't get much sleep, for the dinner hour lasted until nearly midnight, and they called us up before daylight to set the tables. For 4 days I lived in a nightgown, my hair trailing down my back and blowing in my face.
That nightgown is all she'll make it to America with. It's a dismal scene. Many of these women have been separated from everyone they know and can find no one to talk to. Lady Duff Gordon writes about one elderly woman from 3rd class roaming the deck of the Carpathia, wringing her hands and moaning, and no one understands what language she speaks. Finally, someone figures out it's Russian, and she's paired with some survivors who can understand. Her story is grim. She's just lost her husband, her brother, and sister-in-law, and all 4 of her children. We can only imagine her anguish as she stands there, in the ruins of what was supposed to be a fresh start on new soil. One of the men who end up on the Carpathia is Bruce Ismay, who is so shocked by the whole disaster that he locks himself in an office and stares mutely at the wall for the entire journey to America. But Molly Brown isn't one to sit down and wait for service. She uses her language lessons to speak to passengers in their native German, French, and Russian, helping them find their friends and family. She rifles through the ship for extra blankets and supplies, giving them to women who sleep in the dining room and corridors. In doing so, she quickly realizes that many of them have lost everything they have, so she harangues the shell-shocked first-class passengers to pony up to help support those with nothing. By the time the Carpathia reaches New York Harbor, Molly has helped form the Survivors Committee, been elected its chair, and raised almost $10,000 for destitute survivors. Molly gets it done. But the scene as they disembark is sobering. Many people crowd the docks, having no idea if their loved ones will appear at the rail to greet them. In the news reports following the sinking, the stats vary wildly from
"Everyone was saved, don't worry,"
to
"No one's made it out alive."
Lists of passengers who lived and died are published in the papers, but these are mostly filled with well-known first-class passengers like J.J. Astor. Imagine being the fiancé, mother, or brother of a second- or third-class passenger, waiting in the drizzling rain to find out your loved one's fate. Lady Duff Gordon writes she would never forget the sight of
10,000 men and women who had waited for over 2 hours in a drizzling rain for news of friends and relatives who had been passengers. Before the ship anchored, we caught glimpses of white, anxious faces and desperate eyes scanning our decks as the vast crowd waited silently. Women wrapped in costly furs and millionaires who had driven up in luxurious cars stood shoulder to shoulder with me and women from the slums, allied in a common sorrow, hoping the same forlorn hope.
The world is horrified by the Titanic disaster, but no more so than the people who lived through it. Of the 413 women aboard, some 103 of them die. That's 3% of the first-class women, 13% of second, and a whopping 49% of third. Why so many? Because they were so deep in the ship on its bottom levels. In the movie Titanic, you'll remember that some third-class passengers were locked down below until there was little chance left of rescue, but only one passenger offered up this version of the story. It seems, in retrospect, to have been untrue. But very few third-class porters went down to tell them what was happening, which meant most sat and waited for instruction for too long. Many others got lost within the ship's labyrinthine passageways, unable to get to the deck before the water caught up. Many didn't speak any English and therefore didn't really know what was happening. There were too few lifeboats and not enough time. There is an inquiry in the U.S. on May 17th, soon after the disaster. 80 people are called in to give testimony on what in the world went wrong. They have one in England too on May 20th. Very few women are allowed to testify at either. Molly Brown, for one, is not amused by this, but she keeps her signature sass. In a letter to her daughter shortly afterward, as full of bluster as ever.
After being brined, salted, and pickled in mid-ocean, I am now high and dry. I have had flowers, letters, telegrams, people until I am befuddled. They are petitioning Congress to give me a medal. If I must call a specialist to examine my head, it is due to the title of Heroine of the Titanic.
Molly will become quite famous for her role in publicizing the plight of the Titanic's more downtrodden survivors. She'll also get involved in settling mining disputes in her home state and the National Women's Trade Union League as an advocate for a minimum wage and an 8-hour workday. She also gets very involved with the fight for suffrage, even running for a political seat as a U.S. Senator well before women can vote. During World War I, she gets involved with aid work and is awarded the French Legion of Honor. This flamboyant, party-loving lady never stops trying to make others' lives better and is worthy of further exploration. If you haven't checked out What's-Her-Name's episode on her yet, I highly recommend it. Back to the inquest. One woman who does speak out is Lady Duff Gordon. She shows up dressed like a queen in a black veil and a purple lined coat. Get it? The hearing is full of society ladies, all wearing signature Lucille outfits in a show of support. Unfortunately, she's there for something much less fabulous than her outfit. to defend herself and Sir Cosmo against some pretty seedy allegations. The crewmen aboard their lifeboat say that Cosmo bribed them all not to turn around and rescue any survivors for fear they'd overturn. Cosmo said that the money was sent later, after he found out the men had all lost their livelihoods when the boat went down. But the press doesn't care. The fact that he, a man, was in a boat with so few people in it encourages them to brand him a coward. He'll keep a low profile for the rest of his days because of it. Lady Duff Gordon, too, will see her fortunes decline in certain quarters. Some unfortunate business deals and lawsuits in the coming years will see her stepping away from her business and designing for private clients instead, and writing for fashion magazines.
I have never been a businesswoman in the strict sense of the word,
she wrote in her autobiography, Discretions and Indiscretions.
Although I have made a fortune in trade. To me, it was always the creative side of my work that mattered. I designed my dresses far more with the object of pleasing myself than to make money, though I was glad enough to spend it when it was made.
Another to testify at the inquest is Bruce Ismay. The fact that he survived when such a huge number of crew members, including the captain, went down with the ship is, it turns out, not a great look.
"What do you think I am?"
he said in the inquiry.
"Do you believe that I'm the sort that would have left that ship as long as there were any women and children on board? That's the thing that hurts. It hurts all the more because it is so false and baseless."
Why don't you tell that to all the third-class women who got left behind? The results of the inquests don't really lay blame on any particular person's door, but it does change the game in maritime travel. From now on, passenger ships must carry enough lifeboats to accommodate everyone on board, and crew have to be trained in their use. Steamers must carry searchlights and have a manned radio 24 hours a day. Later, Molly Brown will get the rich women of Colorado to lobby Congress to reform maritime law, believing firmly after her experience that no father should be separated from his wife and children. Because of women and children first, many of these ladies lose their loved ones on Titanic. But they also lose money, valuables, and sometimes their livelihoods as well. A difficult thing in this time period when a woman's options for making her own way can be quite limited. Many women go on to sue the White Star Line to recover some of what they lost. Charlotte Drake Cardiza is one of Lady Duff Gordon's clients and will later make the largest claim of any passenger against White Star. The 18-page document states she's lost 14 trunks, 4 bags, a jewel case, and a packing case. She lost the equivalent of some $3.5 million worth of stuff today. Oh my. Of the $16 million they sue for, the company pays a total settlement of $664,000, which, divided, isn't very much at all. Madeline Astor does all right. In his will, JJ leaves her an outright sum of $100,000, the income from a trust fund of $5 million, and a house on Fifth Avenue. Though it does say if she remarries, those last 2 will be lost. On August 14th, 1912, she gives birth to their son, Jakey. She raises him as part of the Astor family for the first few years of his life, but in 1916, she gives up many of her riches to marry again. She's still young, after all, and life goes on. Others have it harder. Because her husband Jacques died with his novel royalties in his pocket, Mae Futrell is out about $17,000. She spends the next few years working to pay those publishers back by serializing her late husband's work and writing another novel of her own. She teaches writing in New York and even hosts a radio show on CBS called Do You Want to Be a Writer? While she's at it in 1940, she almost single-handedly pushes a new federal copyright act through Congress. Work it, Mae! Her friend Renee Harris is also both heartbroken and in some serious money trouble. She'll go on to say she cries for 2 years after the Titanic until her tear ducts decided to stop working altogether. After her husband's will is settled and all debts paid, it becomes clear that her producer husband left them insolvent. Her family tells her to throw in the towel on their business, but she doesn't want to do that. Instead, she pays most of it back and takes a gamble on herself. Her first big play is about syphilis, apparently, and it's actually a big winner. She goes on to produce hit after hit, and she's good at spotting talent. She's the one who picks up Moss Hart, the guy who will later direct My Fair Lady, well before he gets famous. He says of her that she's
rich, racy, and of infinite good humor.
It's all ups and downs from there. Renee goes from millionaire churning through husbands to being ruined by the stock market in the 20s, living in a welfare hotel.
If I had to live my life over,
she'll say later,
I wouldn't change it. After all, I had 12 wonderful, happy, superb, unforgettable years with my first husband. He spoiled me for any other man in the world. I've had 4 marriages, but really, only one husband.
These women live through one of the great tragedies of their lifetimes. Some seek to forget it, others to write about it, and yet others to make sure it never happens to anyone else. Helen Churchill Candy will go on to work in Italy for the Red Cross during World War I and get herself listed in the prestigious Who's Who in America in 1914. She'll also travel extensively in Asia and write some prize-winning books about her time there. Edith Rosenbaum, that fashion writer who commented on Lucille's pretty bathrobe, went into the trenches during World War I to report on the troops' doings. They all continue on as best they can, never forgetting that fateful night that changed everything. Some of them walk away from the disaster feeling as if they owe the world the best they have to give.
I felt I was saved for something,
wrote second-class passenger Edwina Trout later. And so many of them dedicated themselves to making their worlds a better place where they could. Thanks for listening to this mammoth bonus. I asked if a few of you would like to play along and do some voiceovers for this episode, and I was amazed by your response. Thanks to the moon and back to the following voiceover legends: Courtney, who played Jean Hippatch, Cecilia, who played Helen Churchill Candy, Emily, who played May Futrell, Melissa B., who played Caroline Brown, Sarah, who played Ida Strauss, Iris, who played Lady Duff Gordon, Veronica, who played Renee Harris, Heidi from Vibrant Visionary Podcast, who played Molly Brown, Kat, who played Helen Walton Bishop, Maggie, who played Edith Rosenbaum, and Megan, who played Violet Jessup. If you like The Exploress, tell a friend about it. Leave a review wherever you listen, as that really helps other people find it. Become a patron of the show, or just shoot me a message at theexploresspodcast@gmail.com and tell me what you like about the show. Hearing from you always delights me. You can also pick up a copy of my novel, Nightbirds, which is out wherever good books or audiobooks are sold. Head over to my website, theexploresspodcast.com, for show notes, a transcript, and lots of cool images. Or come find me on Instagram at The Exploress Podcast. Until next time.